I will never forget the day I found out I was pregnant. We had been trying for years and thought it was never going to happen. So, when the second line showed up on that pregnancy test, I couldn't believe my eyes. I even made my husband run out and buy 2 more just to make sure. All 3 came out positive. Finally, this was the last piece in our puzzle we were waiting for. It was like a dream come true. We were already married and living in our dream home with a big back garden that was perfect for adventurous kids. In the middle of the garden there was an old oak tree that they could climb. One of the first things we did was put up a tire swing on it. We knew it would be years before he would be able to use it, but with the thoughts of a little one running around, we just couldn't wait. We had to do something. My husband was like a big kid himself. He wouldn't shut up about all the adventures he was going to take him on, even though I explained to him repeatedly that it would be a few years before the baby would be able to do things like that. I just think he was happy to finally have someone to play with and forgot all about the baby stage, until Harry arrived. Don't get me wrong, he was a good husband and dad. He did a lot for me during the pregnancy. When Harry was born, I needed an emergency C-section and there were complications. It took a while to recover from it. So, for the first few months after Harry came home, Dan did nearly everything for him, from night feeds to changing diapers. Which must have been hard. He is one of the most impatient people I know, so, it was a bit of a challenge. It took a little bit of time for us both to adjust, I suppose. There were plenty of stressful days and sleepless nights too, but when I was back on my feet, we managed to get into our own rhythm. After that, everything went smoothly for us, well, as smooth as it can be with a new baby in the house, I mean. I think he was almost 3 months old when I first noticed something odd. I was holding him in my arms while feeding him and staring into his beautiful blue eyes as usual. When suddenly he stopped feeding and started staring at me with this strange look in his eyes, kind of like he was angry with me. I assumed it was just gas and put him on my shoulder to burp him. What happened next, I swear to you, is true. I was rubbing his back, when he moved suddenly and slipped off my shoulder. Luckily, I caught him before he fell, but unfortunately, I pinched him with my nails in the process. He didn't cry or anything, he just made a growling noise. I gave him a hug and a kiss before putting him back up on my shoulder. A few seconds later I heard him whisper something in my ear. It sounded like, "cunt." I just laughed. It had to be one of his little baby noises, I thought, and continued rubbing his back. Not long after I heard it again, "cunt." This time it was loud and clear. I put him sitting on my knee and repeated, "Did you say a bad word, cutie? Did you?" jokingly in my usual silly voice. He stared into my eyes without breaking eye contact or even blinking, with a strange look I had not seen before, for about 5 minutes. I thought he might still have had some gas, so I put him back up on my shoulder and started rubbing his back with my hand. He started pushing his head closer and closer to my face until he was near my ear, then suddenly he grabbed onto one of my earrings with his mouth and started shaking his head. I tried to pull him away, but he would not let go. It was so painful, I thought he was going to rip it off my ear, but luckily, I managed to open it before he got the chance. When I put him sitting back down on my knee, he spit it out and hit me on the side of the face, then smirked at me with this creepy grin. At the time I thought it was just one big coincidence. I could never imagine he could have hurt anyone on purpose. How could I? He was only a baby. When my husband got home, I told him what had happened, and we both had a good laugh about it, but I never wore earrings around him again. The rest of that night was uneventful. It was my husband's turn to get up with him. So, it was the next morning after my husband went to work before I was alone with Harry again. It was also the last day of my parental leave, so I was going to try make the most of it and bring him to the park. He loved looking at the ducks. Before I left, I decided to change his diaper. He was not happy about it. When I tried to undress him, he kept kicking me unusually hard. I didn't know what was wrong with him. I had never seen him like that before. When I finally got him fully dressed, he gave me the finger. "I know what you think, just baby stuff." Well, that's what I thought at the time. Even though he looked into my eyes while grinding his, I would say teeth, but he didn't have any. For the rest of that day, he did not look at me once, not even when I fed him. That night it was my turn to get up and feed him, but I had trouble sleeping. I think I was just stressed with the thoughts of going back to work after that long break. I was just lying there when I heard something on the baby monitor. It sounded like someone muttering to themselves. I thought maybe our lines got crossed and we were picking up someone else's monitor, but I got up and checked on him to make sure. I sneaked quietly down the hallway so not to wake him and looked in through the crack in the partially open door. I was shocked with what I saw. He was sitting up looking around. I was amazed. He was not supposed to be able to do that for another few months, so I ran up and got my phone to record him. On my way back down, he screamed and frightened me. It was so loud I thought there must have been something seriously wrong with him. When I got there, I found him lying on the floor just inside the door. He had made so much noise he woke my husband. He found me standing over Harry and thought I had dropped him. I tried to tell him I found him like that, but he just would not believe me. When my husband put him up on his shoulder to console him, Harry smiled over at me with, I know this sounds weird to say about a baby, but with a smug look on his face. After that, things went downhill for me. It seemed like any time I was near him there were problems, from screaming when I touched him when my husband was around to pinching, scraping, or throwing things at me when we were alone. I'm sure my husband thought I was hurting Harry on purpose. He didn't say it to me, but he was always looking over my shoulder anytime I was near the baby. I tried my best to improve my relationship with him, but it was hard. I worked long hours and he was usually in bed when I got home. The only time I got to spend with him was on the weekends, even then it might only be for a few hours, and I practically spent no time alone with him. Eventually I felt like I had no choice but to take a step back from my responsibilities at work, which meant a demotion and a sufficient salary reduction, but at least I would get home at a reasonable hour. My husband was very supportive of my decision. He said he was just happy we would be able to spend more time together, which was nice to hear. For the first few weeks everything couldn't have gone better. We were finally able to do things as a family. I even started to believe Harry was starting to warm up to me. He still looked like he was disgusted by me and tried to avoid eye contact, but at least he wasn't acting out when I was near him anymore. Things were going good until a few weeks ago. My husband bought a new baby monitor with a camera. The other one mysteriously disappeared one night after putting Harry to bed. I really liked it. I was able to watch him sleep and got into the habit of watching the monitor every night before I fell asleep. Somehow, I think he knew, and he didn't like it. He started sitting up in his cot staring into the camera until I fell asleep. Anytime I tried to show my husband what he was doing, Harry would just fall back and pretend he was asleep before he got a chance to see him. The more I watched, the more it started to creep me out. It was like he could see me. I often dozed off. When I woke, I would see him scanning the room as if he were looking for something. Then he would quickly turn to the camera again and stare at me until I fell asleep. I always thought me and Harry's problems were caused by us not bonding properly when we came home from hospital, and all the weird things that happened were just in my head, but I was wrong. Last night I woke to the sound of Harry laughing. When I checked the monitor, he wasn't in his cot. I tried to call my husband, but no matter what I did he wouldn't wake up. I ran down and checked every part of his room, but he was not there. I was really beginning to worry at this stage. I was ready to call the police, when I thought I heard a noise downstairs, but he wasn't there, so I ran back up in a panic to get my phone. Then I heard what sounded like mumbling. It seemed like it was coming from my room. When I opened the door, I was horrified with what I saw. Harry was sitting on my husband's chest with his hands over his mouth chanting. My husband's legs were shaking, and he was struggling to breathe. I panicked and pushed Harry onto the bed and started doing CPR. The whole time Harry laughed hysterically. For nearly 10 minutes I did everything I could to save him, but nothing I did was working. I thought he was going to die. I was so scared. By the time the paramedics got there he had stopped moving altogether. They got to work on him straight away and found a pacifier wedged deep in his throat. Luckily, they got it out just in time. They said if I didn't do CPR, he wouldn't have made it. Thank God he is going to be okay, but he will be kept in for a few days. The problem is now I am stuck at home with Harry, and I am afraid of what he will do to me. After they took him to the ER, I rang my mom and told her my husband was in hospital. She came straight over. I thought about telling her the truth, but I was afraid she wouldn't believe me. When she asked how it happened, I didn't know how to answer. How could I explain to her that her 6-month-old grandson got out of his cot in the middle of the night, sneaked into our room, climbed on the bed, then shoved a pacifier down my husband's throat? She definitely would have thought I lost my mind and blamed me for everything. At that stage I was starting to have doubts about it myself. I thought maybe I was going insane. To be honest, I would prefer that, at least I would be able to get some help. In the end, it was just easier to tell her that he was lying down with Harry on his chest and the pacifier fell into his mouth. I rushed out the door before she asked any more questions. When I got to the hospital, they wouldn't let me see him. They said that he was still unconscious, and they were worried he might have some brain damage from lack of oxygen, so they needed to do some tests. That was the longest night of my life. I spent the whole time pacing up and down the corridors. The next morning, they told me everything had come back, and they could not find anything wrong with him, apart from some slight damage to his throat. Which was positive, but they didn't know for sure until he woke up. When they finally let me see him, I cried. There were tubes coming out of everywhere, his throat was purple and swollen to twice its normal size. I stayed with him as long as I could, mostly because I was too scared to go home and face Harry. That night I had no choice. I needed clothes and hadn't slept in 2 days. Luckily my mom offered to stay with me for the night, at least I wouldn't be on my own. When I got home, I was relieved that Harry was in bed. I didn't have to face him. I know how crazy I sound, but I genuinely feared my baby. Unfortunately, Mom wasn't able to take care of Harry the next day, but she did organize a babysitter, which was not easy since it was the weekend. I woke up to my mom handing me a cup of coffee. She said she had to go, and she would check in later. After I walked her out, I went to the kitchen where Harry was sitting in his high chair with his breakfast in front of him. He watched me the whole time with a concerned look on his face. It was so weird. I think he was surprised I came back. At 12 o'clock the babysitter came. I was happy to get out of there. It's not easy acting normal around him after what he did. As quickly as I could I left and went to visit my husband. The nurse said there was no real change, and he was still unconscious. I stayed with him all day. It was torture seeing him like that, but at least I didn't have to go home, not until that night anyway. I had asked Jean the babysitter to have him in bed by 8:30. I came home at 10 to make sure he was asleep, but before I opened the door, I could hear him crying. To tell you the truth, I felt like turning around and walking away never to return, but I couldn't. Whatever he is or whatever he did, he was still my child and I loved him. When I went inside, he stopped and smiled over at me, which was very weird, not because it was creepy or angry like usual, no, because it looked genuine. I don't think he ever smiled at me like that before. I was confused and a little freaked out. Jean told me she tried to put him to bed but he kept on crying. She said he must have missed his mommy because he stopped when he saw me, which worried me. After she left, I put him to bed. Again he just stared at me with amazement. I watched him on the monitor for a while. That was the first time I saw him lying down like that since before all this started. I got up 10 or 11 times that night to check on him, but he was asleep every time. The next morning the same thing happened. It was strange, he was acting like a normal baby. I thought everything was going well until I came home the next day because of a phone call from Jean. She was crying so much when she rang, so I left the hospital immediately. When I got there, she was standing outside. She was crying so much I couldn't understand her. I thought something had happened to Harry and ran inside, but he was sitting in the middle of the floor smiling. When I went back out, she was gone. I tried to ring her but there was no answer, so I tried the agency she worked for and told them what happened. They said they would get back to me as soon as they could. I was worried. I thought maybe Harry hurt her like he did my husband. I kept a close eye on him for the rest of that night. But he was acting normal, well, normal for Harry, apart from the fact that he was still watching everything I did. Jean was supposed to be there at 8 the next morning. I tried ringing her, but her phone was off, so again I phoned the agency. As soon as I said my name, I knew there was something wrong, because the girl panicked and asked me to hold. An hour later I was still on hold, so I decided to hang up and ring again. This time they hung up straight away. I became impatient and wouldn't give up, so I kept ringing and ringing until finally, a man with a deep voice came on the phone. He said, "I am very sorry, Mrs., but because of unforeseen circumstances we will be unable to do business with you anymore. We are sorry for any inconvenience. We will give you a full refund for everything you paid for our services. Now please, do not ring here again." Then he just hung up. What does that even mean? I tried to ring back and ask him what happened, but I'm sure they blocked my number because it wouldn't even ring. I spent most of that day trying to find a replacement. When I finally did, they said they couldn't come out until the following morning. It was not all bad. I got a call from the hospital that night. They said my husband was awake. I was so happy. I wanted to go see him there and then, but it was too late. I couldn't sleep that night. I was too excited to see my husband. The next morning, as soon as the babysitter Lucy arrived, I was gone out the door. I really missed talking to him and couldn't wait to tell him how much I loved him. I don't know what I would have done if he didn't make it. When I got near his room, a nurse came up to me and said he didn't want to see me. I was heartbroken. I begged her to let me in for even a minute, but she said she couldn't without his permission. I had no choice but to go home. I cried all night. I was sure my marriage was over. I didn't say anything about it around Harry, but I think he knew there was something up, because he started standing up watching the camera that night. I went back to the hospital the next day. I thought if I just got to talk to him, I could explain what happened and it would fix everything, but he refused to see me. I hung around all that day in the hospital hoping he might change his mind, which gave me a lot of time to think. I realized he must have thought it was me who shoved the pacifier down his throat. The doctor said it was pushed down with a lot of force. There was no way he would believe it was Harry. If I got talking to him and blamed the baby, I would risk losing them both. Then again, I didn't even know what he remembered. Maybe he remembered everything and was afraid of Harry. If so, would I have to choose between my husband and my baby? This is all so crazy. When visiting hours ended, they asked me to leave. Before I left, I begged them to ring me straight away if he changed his mind. They said they would, but I'm sure they were just trying to get rid of me. When I got home, Lucy told me Harry was acting up all day. He hit her across the nose with his bottle when she tried to feed him, and it was still bleeding when I got there. He also pulled 2 handfuls of hair out of her head, and she had a bald patch. She was really upset over it, but what could I say? Only I am sorry. Harry was okay for me that night. He went to bed with no problems and slept all night, which was a relief. I really wasn't able for him. I was too upset. The next morning, I called my mom to look after Harry, as it was Lucy's day off. I never told her he refused to see me. I just said I was going to visit him. I was too embarrassed to tell her the truth. Then I just rushed out the door and went back to the hospital. I waited there all day again in hopes he might see me. I think the nurses were starting to feel sorry for me. They kept coming over asking if I was okay. I told them all I wanted was to see my husband. I am not sure if it was because of them or not, but later that day one of the nurses told me he wanted to see me. I broke down in tears. I was so happy. When I got in there, he was sitting up on the bed. He looked nervous. To be honest, so was I. I had no idea what to say to him and was terrified about what he was going to say to me. I sat down quietly on a chair at the edge of his bed and waited for him to speak. For a moment he stared blankly out the window, then he started to speak softly in a hoarse voice. "I love you and don't want us to end like this, and I don't blame you for what happened." As he paused to get a drink of water and clear his throat, I was sure he had remembered what had happened and knew what Harry did, which was a bit of a relief. Someone would finally believe me. He continued, "You need help, I know that now. It's my fault. I knew you were having problems for a while and I ignored it, even when you were getting hallucinations. I am truly sorry for that, and I promise I will be there for you however long it takes for you to get better." I didn't know how to react or what to say. I was happy he still loved me and wanted to stay, but I was confused and a little concerned about what he wanted me to do. He said he wanted me to see a doctor straight away to find out what's wrong with me. When I asked him what he thought had happened, he told me the last thing he remembered he was in pain, and I was standing over him and he couldn't breathe. I wanted to tell him it wasn't me, I was only giving him CPR, but there was no point, there was no way he would have believed me. So, I said nothing and let him believe it was me. I agreed with all his terms, at least that way I wouldn't lose him. That evening when I got home, my mom was in the kitchen. Harry was sitting in his high chair playing with his toy blocks. When I told her my husband would be coming home in a couple of days, Harry freaked out. He started throwing his blocks around the room, then grabbed his chair with both hands and started shaking it aggressively. He looked possessed. Even my mom was a bit scared. When she went over to try to calm him down, he screamed in her face, which frightened her, and she fell, spraining her elbow in the process. Then he stopped and went back to normal as if nothing happened. After my mom left, I put him to bed and called it a night myself. When I checked the monitor, Harry was standing up smiling at me. I just ignored him and went to sleep. Later I was awoken by the sound of footsteps in the room, so I turned on the light and looked around. What I saw terrified me beyond comprehension. On my husband's pillow was one of Harry's pacifiers. I know I didn't leave it there. I checked the monitor. Harry was standing up. He smiled at me for a moment before he lay down and turned away. I was sure he was sending me a message. I stayed awake for the rest of that night trying to figure out what to do. In the end I decided to try to bargain with him, so the next morning I gave him his favorite breakfast, then took him to the park. On the way home I stopped to pick up some new toys. I thought if I was really nice to him, he would listen to me and not hurt my husband. When we got home, I put him in his chair, gave him a treat and began to explain his dad would be home the following day. Then I begged him not to hurt him. I told him I would do anything if he just left him alone. He just looked down at his chocolate as if he was contemplating, before laughing hysterically while banging his hands on the table. This lasted about 5 minutes, then he suddenly stopped and started breathing extremely heavily through his nose with a look of pure hate on his face. Then he stopped, smiled and began eating his chocolate as if nothing happened. I am really worried about what he will do to my husband when he comes home, but there is nothing I can do about it.